Good morning. How's your vocabulary? Ooh. Let's do a test. Now, I know some of you are young enough to have never actually cracked a dictionary, and that wounds my nerdy heart greatly. I own several dictionaries from different eras, but this one in particular was a gift to my sons from their great-grandmother for school. Now, it's a little hilarious when you think about how heavy it is. I mean, like really, you guys, right? The fact that they'd have to share it, and a little thing called the internet that requires no locker space. My name is Chantal. I'm still learning. And I'm on the teaching team. During dinner this spring, my youngest asked the meaning of a word, and like it had been said to us as kids, David and I both said, go Google it. No, look it up in the dictionary. Now, we try to avoid using screens at the table, so he actually had to use the alphabetical listing of this beast to look up his word. Now, of course, this led us to quizzing each other on some very unfamiliar words. And just a note, in case you're wondering, irregardless is not a word, okay? So please stop using it. Okay, got that off my chest. All right, so one of the words we came across was lugubrious. This is from the Greek, if you wanted to know. It's an adjective, and it means mournful, especially exaggeratedly or affectedly. In other words, quite dramatic. Another word that we learned is specious, another adjective, and it means showy, having deceptive attraction or allure, having a false look of truth or genuineness. Now, at one point, we're going through this new favorite game of mine, and I literally say that out loud. This is my new favorite game. I told you, word nerd. But if I didn't tell you that this was a dictionary, it could pass for a Bible. And sometimes people use their Bible like a dictionary. They're looking for black and white definitions, they're looking for explicit rules, and orderly lists of life. But in this series, we're looking at parables, which are teachings held in story form. This is implicit, because an understanding of the imagery of the time is required. The parables describe a kingdom that is actually counter to every script we have been handed. And we have to figure out what it means for us in this day and in this age. These are not recipes. So now let me ask you, how's your cooking? Now before you answer, let me tell you about mine. This one time, I put a banana cake in the oven ahead of after-school pickup, and I was feeling so accomplished. I felt so great about myself that on the way back home, I had this happy thought of going shopping. So I say to the boys, let's go to Winners. Let's go check out to see if they have that totally unessential item that I've been thinking about. It wasn't until right before the turnoff that I realized that that cake was still in the oven, basking in 400-degree rays that would soon become Cajun flames. I nervously laughed all the way home and debated telling my husband about that one. Another time we had planned to make Oma's meat buns. Planned is used loosely here, because I had not baked since I had started working full-time, but everything should be on hand, right? I haven't been using anything. Except that on that day, I had eaten the last 2 eggs for breakfast, and then no one answered at the neighboring houses when I sent my oldest to go ask. NBD, I'm thinking, no big deal. We'll just skip the eggs. I started warming the milk. This is a true story, you guys. I warmed the milk, I added the yeast, then I realized the eggs were the least of my worries. I had no flour. I had to rush to the store while the yeast is doing its thing in the milk, and then I almost forgot to buy the eggs, too. Food is not my strength, you guys. Usually my best cooking is when I'm making a new recipe for the first time, because it's almost the only time I follow it to the letter. It's kind of funny and not funny at the same time. Do you have a quirky feature like that? The truth is I could train myself to do better, but that would require commitment that I'm not prepared for. The question for us in making sense of Jesus' teaching is, what will we commit ourselves to? When Jesus gathered his disciples on a mount near the Sea of Galilee, after he'd been teaching and preaching and healing all around the area, he said a few things that may have been confusing to his disciples. Matthew 5:13 says this. He said to them, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet." Margaret Feinberg describes the symbolism of salt in Scripture in a recent article. So, traditionally, salt is used to preserve meat. In small amounts when cooking, it cuts bitterness to enhance sweetness, and in higher amounts, it cuts sweetness to enhance savory flavors. Salted caramel, anyone? We know that salt is an electrolyte, it leaves a residue, and Feinberg suggests that we can preserve the presence of Christ in our lives for long-lasting soul food, and that Christ brings out the best in us as we interact with others. That's the symbol of salt. Salt is a harmonizing element, but she adds one more vital bit. While fertilizing salt will break down manure and feed plants, it can become diluted by other substances. It can lose its saltiness. In other words, we are sprinkled out into the world, but we are going to need Christian community because too little salt in a vast place makes it indistinguishable. Then he said this to them, goes on in Matthew 5:14. "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Now, how's your visibility? Sorry. That was loud. Too often in history, the imagery of light into darkness was that of progression that actually resulted in oppression. Think of the medieval crusades and motherland colonization. Supposed light bearers were actually agents of darkness. In my work as a school psychologist in Canada's only First Nations school system, I learned that Mennonite missionaries burned all of the traditional items in a community that I work in. That is a sobering legacy when a Wiebe, like myself, is welcomed off the plane to provide service. Now, Jesus calls himself the light of the world in John 8:12, but in this Matthew passage, he's naming his disciples as light of the world. Why? To be and do what Jesus himself did, to exhibit such self-sacrifice, which is motivated by love, not pity, that he died for others. He abandoned judgment for mercy and compassion. And when Jesus referenced a city on a hill, I wonder if his listeners would have thought of Zion. I stumbled upon Zion while reading Leap Over a Wall by Eugene Peterson. Zion is a real place, and it is first mentioned in 2 Samuel 5:7 when David conquers the city of Jerusalem. The entrance had been guarded by 2 hydraulically powered machines that mocked lame Jacob and blind Isaac, who are the forefathers of Israel. They were rigged up with the water system to belch and bellow a fearsome noise. No one traveled there on purpose. Now, having just been made king, David needed this border town of Jerusalem logistically to unite the northern tribes and southern Judah as a royal capital. He tore down the lame and the blind structures, and not a single life was lost. He tore down the inhospitable reputation of Jerusalem. So Zion can serve as a beacon in this way. It is safe, first of all. Zion itself is revered in the Bible, but there are several biblical references to daughter of Zion, which is a metaphor for the relational care found there. It implies a love as common as a father and as extraordinary as God, one that is unwavering, unabashed, and undeserved. This is not love earned by merit, but by mere existence. We enter the mother city as a daughter, as a son. It also feels like home. Now, the word Zion itself translates to indication or marking. so that by one's devotion to God, we can always be returned to him. We could never be lost. Something that is marked can never be lost. Zion is a holy place, but it's also a homeland. Now, it is tempting to visualize a gleaming gold Jerusalem, but actually the richness of God's redemption makes Zion an earthy communion. Do not imagine surface comfort and ease, but with full heartache and hurt, we can come home to Zion, where God is with us as we are. Psalm 87 verse 2 says, "The Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the other dwellings of Jacob." Zion is merciful. God gave us emotions. We are not to fear our emotions, but he wants us to be honest with them. So if it is true that grace does not destroy, but only intensify and elevate the feelings of nature, then while the law was founded at Mount Sinai, God is found at Mount Zion. Finally, Zion tells us it is not about us. 2 Samuel 5:10 describes that after reforming Jerusalem, David became greater and greater for the Lord. Now, we can easily aspire to becoming insta-famous, well-known, recognized. But Eugene Peterson describes the Hebrew as David walking with a longer stride and a larger embrace. He welcomed, he engaged. God wanted him big on the inside, not just the outside. Even now, we get caught in sacrificing what God is building within us for what we think we can do for God. Here's the Message Bible at the end of Romans 9, 31 to 32. It says this, "And Israel, who seemed so interested in reading and talking about what God was doing, missed it." How could they miss it? Because instead of trusting God, they took over. They were absorbed in what they themselves were doing. They were so absorbed in their God projects that they didn't notice God right in front of them, like a huge rock in the middle of the road. And so they stumbled into him and went sprawling. Isaiah again gives us the metaphor for pulling this all together. "Careful, I have put a huge stone on the road to Mount Zion, a stone you can't get around, but the stone is me. If you're looking for me, you'll find me on the way, not in the way." Now, just before Jesus called his disciples to be salt and light, he said these words to them. He opened his mouth and he taught them, saying, Matthew 5, 1 to 11, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Have you heard these before? "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account." If you are like me, this sounds familiar, but it begs explanation. Where's Google when you need it? To be honest, these are not truths. Mourners often go uncomforted. Victims do not always get justice, and the meek, well, kind of usually the nice guys who finish last. This section is called the Beatitudes because the Latin word beatus means blessed. But this is not a list of situations that most people would caption as #blessed. Let's look at this passage again through the Message. Now, the Message is a paraphrase, not a literal translation, but it provides a little more clarity, at least for me. When Jesus saw his ministry drawing huge crowds, he climbed a hillside. Those who were apprenticed to him, the committed, climbed with him, and arriving at a quite quiet place, he sat down and taught his climbing companions, and this is what he said. "You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God." Someone say more of God. "You're blessed when you feel you've lost what is most dear to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one most dear to you. You're blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more, no less. That's the moment you find yourselves proud owners of everything that can't be bought. Someone say content. I might have a Mennonite last name, but I was raised Pentecostal, so. You're blessed when you've worked up a good appetite for God. He's food and drink and the best meal you'll ever eat. You're blessed when you care. At the moment of being careful, you find yourselves cared for. Say cared for. You're blessed when you get your inside world, your mind and your heart put right. Then you can see God in the outside world. You're blessed when you can show people how to cooperate instead of compete or fight. I need this one, guys. That's when you discover who you really are and your place in God's family. You're blessed when your commitment to God provokes persecution. The persecution drives you even deeper into God's kingdom. Now, phrased this way, I see this as an announcement that from here on out, God's promises from heaven take shape on earth, in and through us, because what we believe about the life and death of Jesus affects our actions, where we live, and how we work right now. Now, part of us still questions, though, when we see suffering, did God leave the kitchen unattended? Did he forget to measure out all the necessary parts for our daily bread? We wonder if Jesus is all that he says he is, and by extension, am I all that he says I am? Is he relevant to the present? Let's look at the rulers of Jesus' day. Now, at this time, when Jesus is talking, Herod Antipas governs the area, and he will soon execute John the Baptist. Now, he's one of the sons of Herod the Great, who tried to have Jesus killed near the time of his birth by ordering the mass murder of Jewish infants and toddlers. This, of course, caused Jesus and his parents to flee to Egypt as refugees. Now, in between this tale of two Herods was another son of Herod the Great, who caused Jesus and his family to immigrate to Nazareth rather than Judea upon their return from Egypt. That means, you guys, that Jesus knows what it means to live under nepotism, refugee status, cruel immigration practices, and the legacy of trauma. Let's look at Jesus' location. Galilee technically has a lake, not a sea. It's known for its fish, and at least 4 of Jesus' disciples were from that area, and some of whom he called right off the shores. That's significant when we know that fishing families were typically poor and lived subsistence lives. Now, this was not a free fishing market. The export of salted, dried, and pickled fish benefited only the luxurious living of the ruling elite. The gap between the rich and poor, due to this state-controlled exploitation, led some families to hide their hauls or form quiet cooperatives. Jesus knows what eking out a living under economic disparity looks like, and he still uses the word blessed. This is the unexpected way that Jesus was all about. Through undesirable circumstances, he uses the characteristics of salt and light to stand in contrast to the bossy, noisy types. If you're a millennial, that's the extra and the thirsty. Now, when I was a kid, I believed definitively, and I argued this to the death, that several meant 7. I was so confident I didn't look it up in my favorite dictionary. Do you recall a time when you were so sure of something only to discover you were not only wrong, but way wrong? Imagine the disciples at this moment, realizing that God's revolution is more spiritual than physical. Now, I'm not going to stand here and have you be confused that being salty and throwing shade is salt and light. Not the case. Here at church, people in this very room could retell you the times that I have left a bad taste in their mouth. When my boys were small, I volunteered us 3 to bag lunches for the teenagers who were giving up their spring break to serve inner city youth. We were supposed to arrive at 9 a.m., so early in the morning when you have 2 little kids, and I was already emotionally depleted, and we live about 45 minutes away. And when we arrived, the work had already been done. We were turned away. And I said, please, is there something else that we could do? We came from a very far distance, but no, there was nothing. I think more than anything, my pride was hurt. So what did I do? I tried to take 2 little boys to Costco. Probably not the best idea. It was a disaster, and as I rolled my cart out along the building, of course into the rain, and it started raining by now, I didn't see that a dear old lady had pulled up her car right along the building, and I couldn't pass. I had to turn and go around. And as I turned my cart to go around, the toilet paper off the bottom fell into a puddle, and I literally lost it. I remember I threw up my hands, and I looked at her, and I said, really? Like it's her fault. But I do regret this moment, and I regret other disappointing revelations of myself like it. I've left a bad taste in people's mouths at times. Is it a challenge for you to be salt and light at work? In my work in the education system, there is a clear divide between teachers and clinicians. It festers and is not uncommon for egos and titles and pseudoscience to get in the way of common ground for a child's best interest. So it is funny, not funny to me, and very fit that God has surrounded me, a clinician, who are typically viewed as outsiders, with teachers as friends and family. We get to practice this dance of trust and respect together regularly. So perhaps theology by itself, like the Old Testament law, is only half the story. It is not complete without his embodiment, just like us. To be salt and light, we must consider how Jesus did things. And he paused quietly when faced with tension. Remember when he was forced to address those who accused a woman and not also the man of adultery? He drew in the sand, but not likely a line. He allowed space for the law and love. He silenced bellowing judgments, and he tore down pretenses of peace. He restored father and daughter, and he recovered grace from shame. And we too must run our responses through reflection, but then not stop there. In the truest form of redemption, the road reclaimed by David on the way up to Jerusalem, which became known as Zion, was the same road Jesus walked down 1,000 years later to his death for us. Jesus really does save everything, bro. Martin Luther is known as a catalyst for the 16th century Protestant Reformation, and he argued for religious and political redistribution of power, but he also had this idea about our effects in the places in which we live and work. This is what he said. The Christian shoemaker does his duty not by putting little crosses on the shoes, but by making good shoes, because God is interested in good craftsmanship. God doesn't make junk or seconds or good enoughs. He made you and I, after all, right? For us to be salt and light, it requires us to work ethically and excellently. It means that we commit to serving and not canceling at the last minute, that we examine privilege seriously, that we avoid thirst traps on social media, that we do not profit from the subprime market, and that it costs us to be advocates. Now, in case you are wondering if you are the right person for this calling, consider this. Salt is harvested along with surrounding minerals, and that means your upbringing, your personality, your giftings, and yes, your cooking weaknesses are unique varieties that bring a fresh and needed take. You are the right person for the call. Now, I told you that my favorite game was dictionary quizzing. But my most favorite reflection about this salt and light passage is that nowhere does he tell us to sweeten or sugarcoat. Let me show you a clip that I use in schools. Inside Out is a film about 12-year-old Riley who's experiencing a lot in her life. This bit is about how Riley's emotions, joy and sadness, try to comfort her imaginary friend, Bing Bong, inside her mind. No, you can't. She listened to what he had to say. Joy uses distraction and silliness. She discounts the problem. She skims the surface and pressures a fast turnaround. She uses physical touch, but coercively, trying to pull Bing Bong along. She says a lot and nothing at the same time. Now, at first glance, it looks like sadness makes things worse because Bing Bong actually breaks down more, but sadness sits in the same place as Bing Bong. She affirms his hurt and waits with patience. Sadness doesn't need to say much to be the light that joy can't. In this moment, joy isn't real. Only acknowledgement of pain, disappointment, and actual, real, down in the dirt community can do that. Salt and light means that we are visible, but not for specious or superficially perfect display. It means we are comfortable sitting with pain, but not in a lugubrious or overstated fashion. As someone who understands sadness, this is how I believe God reclaims my history of trauma, abuse, anxiety, and depression. It is part of who I am, and he still uses the word blessed. How will you be salt and light in your neighborhood, your particular job, an everyday grocery run? What has God redeemed that commits you to him? Whatever it is, know that you are marked and set apart, and you can never be lost to him. Will you be and live that?
One of the things that we love doing here at the Meeting Place, you may have seen it up on the screen, is doing a question and response time. And we really want to emphasize that this is a response. It's not a direct answer. There's always a longer conversation. If you do have a question following a sermon or following a teach that happens, you can ask it now. You can also come up afterwards. You can also call us in the office. But the point is that we like to be in conversation, that we realize that our faith journey and our walking with Jesus is not just about listening to somebody talk at us for 20 minutes and then that's it, but it's ongoing and that we have questions. So thank you for being willing to answer questions.
Can we reiterate Carolyn's response where she often comes up with an answer on Tuesday?
Yeah.
Message me on Tuesday.
So if you see her in Starbucks on Tuesday, then you can ask her.
Response,
okay.
Sorry, yeah.
Sounds good. So first question, relating to kind of what you're talking about at the end of your teach, I have a hard time sitting with someone, being in their space, and not fixing their problem. How can I be salt and light in that relationship?
Listen. We have to get better at listening. And one of the first things that I will say I learned in my career as a consultant is that very rarely do you actually need to give advice. There's a lot to be said by saying very little. Listening and hearing and affirming that you've heard. It's a very powerful thing to come alongside someone and actually say, I don't really know what to say, but I'm here for you if you need someone to listen to you. So it makes us uncomfortable because we're often taught from a young age to be afraid of big emotions. And I think that we need to flip that around a little bit, that emotions are given to us and they're meant for us to be shared in a way that helps us co-regulate each other. So because things don't always make sense, it's helpful for us to at least talk about it with someone else. And really, the reality is in listening for a couple of minutes or even an hour, it's unlikely you will be able to solve their problem anyway. Usually the things that are the big things that are causing people heartache are not easily solvable, or they would have done it themselves already. So there's great power in pausing, allowing space for silence, and listening. It might be uncomfortable for us, and we have to examine why that is. Maybe the messages we heard growing up is that big emotions are to be feared. So if that's difficult to do, then practice with smaller things and using silence and listening, being willing to listen.
Well, even as was demonstrated in the clip, where sadness just stopped and said, that's really hard.
Yeah.
That's really hard.
It's affirming, yes,
Yeah.
I get it. I would be mad too. I would be super disappointed.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay. What does it mean for me to be salt and light among my friends who aren't Christians? Just the topic of Jesus causes them to change conversation.
I guess you would do it practically. I mean, many of us work in places that are not Christian environments, and so we're not also actively out there, quote unquote, evangelizing, but we are evangelizing by our actions. And so with friends or coworkers or family who are not Christian and not willing to hear Jesus' name or anything about the Bible, how we live and act that's different than what our friends are doing might be a way to do that. I mean, one example might be that you don't share a Netflix account, or you tip appropriately, or I mean, there's various ways of picking the things that you are going to be distinctive about because of principle. And that might be some examples of doing that. It's figuring out ways of how you live and work that are based on your belief, but you're not necessarily saying the name of Jesus as you do it. If someone asks you, then you give your response and the reasons why.
It's good.
Help me out, Pastor.
I think it looks different for all of us in our lives, in our context, right? One of my favorite quotes, I would say, in response to a question like this is from St. Francis of Assisi, where he talks about preaching the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words.
Yes.
Which is, for a verbal processor like me, that's hard. That's hard for me to show that with my actions, but it's so important in the vocabulary that we use, how we speak about people that we don't know, the person that cuts me off when I'm driving down the street on my way to work, and the way that I share that story when I get to work. It can look so differently in any context, but if we're looking at the life of Jesus and how he lived his life, how he spoke about other people, how he spoke to people, and that it was about loving them, that it's about the command to love the Lord our God with our whole heart and a command to love our neighbor. I'm starting to preach. I'm going to stop talking.
But that's a good reminder. Pray for Carmen because she's teaching next week.
Oh.
Right? Yes.
We need your prayers.
Yes.
Always. We need your prayers. Okay, I've got one more question for you.
Oh, I thought I was getting out of it. Okay.
I know. One more. So if we just stand there shining, being the light, does that fulfill Jesus' commission to go out and make disciples?
Okay, this might be related to what we just talked about.
Yeah.
Because I feel like we need to define going out and making disciples. We go out every day. You went out to come here, which means you would have parked. You go out to Costco, and hopefully don't raise your arms at old ladies. But you go out to grab dinner, you go out with friends. There's many opportunities to go out and make disciples with your actions and your words. And I think that that's really powerful. There's a quote, Anne Lamott, she says, lighthouses don't go all over the island trying to save people, or save boats. They just stand there shining. And we follow Jesus and not Anne Lamott, but the idea around that is that it is okay to be about your regular business and not necessarily starting a reformation or feeding children in an orphanage in Calcutta, that means that that's when you're part of the church, or that's you making disciples in your everyday work on the construction site, that you are living and doing things differently, and people take notice.
Thanks for engaging us in conversation, Chantal. That's all we have for questions for today.
Thank you.
But feel free to come up and chat with her after the service.